I always believed Avengers Endgame ended the Infinity Saga with certainty. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized we never reached the real ending. We reached the beginning. There's a secret hiding in plain sight, a moment so small that most people never even questioned it. July 4th, 1970. A date that sits like a fracture in the MCU timeline. A day that rewrites the Stark legacy, the origins of Tony himself, and maybe even the birth of one of Marvel's greatest villains. When Doctor Strange looked into the future during Endgame, he didn't just see the moment Tony would snap. He saw 1970. He saw a conversation between father and son that the universe could never allow to be forgotten. It was never just about retrieving the Tesseract or the Pym particles. That was the mission on paper, but not in reality. In reality, fate was steering Tony Stark into a truth that would break everything he believed. A truth that began with a sentence that Howard Stark should never have said. When Tony and Steve traveled back to 1970, the film frames it as improvisation, a desperate jump, a risky detour, a last chance. But the question I keep returning to is, did they really choose that year? Or was that year chosen for them? S.H.I.E.L.D. was distracted by Independence Day celebrations, the security grid was unfocused, agents were preoccupied. Everything about that day was convenient. Too convenient. Tony slips through the holes, and something about the scene feels staged, like the universe itself was pushing him forward, like a door was being forced open. He turns a corner and finds himself face to face with the ghost of his own mythology, Howard Stark. Their interaction feels warm, emotional, accidental, but the subtext is anything but accidental. History is never gentle when it wants to reveal something. And on July 4th, 1970, history sharpened its teeth. Howard speaks casually at first, almost awkwardly. He's unsure, distracted, not talking like a confident man, but like someone carrying an unbearable weight. Tony tries to hold himself together. He's a man meeting his father without being able to call him dad. But then Howard says a line that should not exist. A line that breaks the timeline. My wife is pregnant. We're expecting another child. All I care about is keeping this one safe. That moment is the crack in the universe, because the math does not add up. Tony Stark's birthday is May 29th, 1970, and this conversation is happening in July. That means the pregnancy Howard is talking about cannot be Tony. This is someone else. Another Stark child. A child that history never acknowledges. A child that never appears in any record, flashback, obituary, or legacy discussion. Across dozens of movies, series, and tie-in materials, the MCU never hints that Tony had a sibling. But Howard's words are not speculation. They are confirmation. Someone else was coming. Someone who wasn't meant to be known. This is where the theory starts to transform, because Marvel fans know that the comics have toyed with this idea before. In certain comic continuities, Tony Stark is not Howard Stark's biological son. He was adopted, and that adoption wasn't the loving, emotional act that families talk about with pride. It was a classified arrangement. A transaction. Tony Stark was adopted out of Latveria, a nation whose identity is inseparable from one name, Victor Von Doom. In the comics, Howard Stark's involvement with Latveria isn't just political or financial. It's scientific. It's personal. It's a collaboration. And if Tony was adopted, that means the unborn child Howard mentions in 1970 might be the only one that carries his actual bloodline. That child, the one he wants to keep safe, is the anomaly, the variable, the secret that the universe had to erase. Because if that child lived, the future would not belong to Tony Stark. It would belong to someone else entirely. This brings us to the black-budget project that was whispered about in comic margins and expanded lore, a project that I believe the MCU has quietly been building toward, Project Prometheus. Not a weapon, not a system, not a machine. A child, an experiment designed to build a mind strong enough to predict the future, alter the future, or survive it. A hybrid of science, mysticism, and quantum resilience. 2 children were tied to this project. One was Tony, the prototype, the adopted heir. the genius built through nurture, technology, and privilege. The other child was something else, a child built through design, genetics, and ambition. A child that Howard Stark feared, even as he created him. This child wasn't lost. He was erased. And if this theory is right, that child wasn't some random, unknown figure. That child grew into Victor Von Doom. Imagine the implications. Doom wouldn't simply be a villain. He would be the consequence of the Stark legacy. A byproduct of Howard Stark's ambition. A mistake built in a lab, not born in a home. A weapon disguised as a son. And what happens when a child realizes he was engineered rather than loved? What happens when that child learns that another boy, Tony, got the name, the resources, the destiny that was intended for him? Doom wouldn't just rage at the world. He would rage at a family name that pretended he never existed. This recontextualizes the entire emotional structure of the MCU. Because Iron Man isn't just the story of a man who learned to be a hero. It might be the story of a man who inherited a destiny that was stolen from someone else. And this, I believe, is why Doctor Strange chose that timeline. Not because it was convenient, not because it was lucky, because out of 14,605 futures, this was the one where Tony comes face to face with the day the universe tried to hide. Strange wasn't just fighting Thanos. He was preparing the world for what comes next. The real war, the multiversal fracture, the moment when the past returns through the doors that were forced shut. Thanos was never the endgame. Thanos was the warm-up. The real threat was always going to come from Latveria, from the erased child who grew into a king, from the brother Tony Stark never knew he had. And if this theory is right, the next phase of the MCU isn't about rebuilding from the ruins of the snap. It's about answering for what happened in 1970. Because the universe doesn't forget what men try to bury. It waits. In part 2, I'll break down how the MCU breadcrumbs line up with this theory, from strange dialogue to Latveria references to why S.H.I.E.L.D. suppressed this information. And I'll explain how Tony and Doom aren't opposite forces, but two halves of the same origin. One built to lead the world, one built to take it. This is only the beginning. The Stark secret is finally waking up. When we left off, the foundation of the theory was set. Tony Stark's journey to 1970 wasn't accidental, and Howard Stark's confession about another unborn child wasn't a sentimental detail. It was a fracture point, a crossroads in the timeline where truth and destiny collided. Now, we go deeper because everything Doctor Strange set into motion begins to take shape when we start examining how the MCU quietly hints at Latveria, Project Prometheus, and the shadow of Victor Von Doom long before the audience even knew to look. The truth doesn't shout. It leaves artifacts. It leaves cracks. It leaves fingerprints across the timeline like bruises covered in makeup. And as I went back through the films, I realized something chilling. The signs were always there. We just didn't know how to read them yet. Strange didn't just hand the time stone to Thanos. He handed the future to Doom. The first trail of breadcrumbs actually starts before Endgame, all the way back in Captain America, the First Avenger. Howard Stark isn't portrayed as a passive inventor or a patriotic scientist. He's a man with access, influence, and a moral compass that bends when the future demands it. His relationship with S.H.I.E.L.D. isn't just professional, it's foundational. And the more we study his work with S.H.I.E.L.D., the more it becomes clear that his projects were not about protecting America. They were about controlling tomorrow. Project Prometheus fits perfectly into this paradigm. Not because we see it physically, but because every decision he makes points toward the creation of something or someone that could survive what he knows is coming. Howard wasn't guessing about the future. He was preparing for it. And that's exactly what makes the second Stark child so critical. That child wasn't just a pregnancy. That child was a contingency. Let's talk about Latveria. The MCU has never fully shown this nation on screen, but its presence exists like a shadow around Europe. On old maps, in background dialogue, in obscure legal documents. It's always there if you look closely enough. Why? Because Doom has always been there. Latveria is the birthplace of a monarch who blends mysticism and science in a way that mirrors something very specific: Stark-level engineering combined with Doctor Strange-level occult knowledge. At first, that combination seems like coincidence, as if Doom simply became a hybrid of both worlds through life experience. But if he was part of Project Prometheus, it isn't coincidence. It's programming. It's design. Howard Stark wasn't building a child who could build weapons. He was building a child who could outthink time. And that, more than anything, explains why S.H.I.E.L.D. buried him. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded. This is where the emotional core of the theory begins to transform. Up until now, we've seen Tony Stark as the heir, the prodigy, the chosen son. But what if Tony was never meant to be the final product? What if he was a prototype the world grew to love, while the actual final design, the perfected hybrid, the successor, was erased from public memory? That turns Tony's entire hero origin into a tragedy hiding beneath a triumph. He didn't just become Iron Man because of a cave, a box of scraps, and a revelation. He became Iron Man because he was filling a space that was never meant to belong to him in the first place. Howard Stark wasn't raising a son. He was raising a replacement. The first child, the one he lost, was the one he feared. And that fear was the compass that guided Project Prometheus into darkness. Now think about Doctor Strange again. The moment he scans 14,605 futures, the moment he pauses, the moment he decides to give the time stone away, something unspoken happens behind his eyes. People assume he looked only at Thanos. But Strange is a sorcerer trained to see beyond singular threats. He doesn't look at battles. He looks at convergences, timeline intersections, mythic inheritance. He sees the past colliding with the future, and suddenly Endgame becomes a ritual rather than a war. Iron Man wasn't the victory condition because Tony Stark was destined to save the world. Tony Stark was the victory condition because by removing him from the board, Strange was clearing the path for the next conflict. Doom cannot rise while Tony lives. Not because Tony would win, but because Tony's existence keeps the Stark legacy incomplete. The prophecy can only activate when the heir of science falls, allowing the heir of science and sorcery to rise. Strange knew. He had no. Which brings us back to that hallway in 1970. That father, that conversation, that impossible moment. Howard Stark saying, "All I care about is keeping this one safe." It isn't a line of hope. It's a line of fear. He knows he created something the world isn't ready for. A child built through intelligence, mysticism, and design. A child containing both brilliance and volatility. He isn't thinking like a father. He's thinking like a scientist scrambling to contain a runaway experiment. And that is where the MCU hides the emotional dagger. Howard Stark loved Tony because Tony was safe, predictable, understandable. But the second child, the erased child, he wasn't born out of love. He was born out of ambition. A child built for the future is also a child built for war. I want to pause here and talk about what this means for Doom's character. If Doom is the erased Stark child, he doesn't just become a villain because of ego. He becomes a villain because he was abandoned. He becomes a monarch not because he wants control, but because control is the only thing that cannot be taken from him. In this version of the MCU, Victor Von Doom is the ultimate tragic figure, a man who learns that his life, his power, and his identity were not accidents of fate. They were engineered outcomes. Tony grows up believing he wasn't good enough. Doom grows up believing he wasn't chosen. Tony becomes a hero to earn his father's approval. Doom becomes a ruler to destroy the system that denied him one. Their conflict isn't philosophical. It's personal. It's blood versus blueprint. It's inheritance versus erasure. This recontextualizes Latveria's future entry into the MCU. They don't arrive as an enemy nation. They arrive as a correction, a reckoning. Think about this. Why hasn't the MCU introduced Dr. Doom yet? Why hasn't Latveria appeared on the world stage? Because the timeline had to wait until Tony Stark was gone. Because the name Stark had to collapse before the name Doom could rise. because the multiverse had to fracture before the hybrid child could step into the light. Doom isn't a phase villain. Doom is the hinge the entire saga pivots on. Kang may be the chaos, but Doom is the direction. And now we return to why Strange chose the one future. Not the one where everyone lives, the one where Tony dies. Not because Tony was expendable, but because Tony was final. The last breath of the wrong air, clearing the path for the Forgotten One to reclaim the legacy that was stolen from him. Endgame wasn't the end of Iron Man. It was the end of the lie that Iron Man was the only one meant to save the world. Strange wasn't saving the universe. He was pruning it, preparing it, resetting the board. Because what comes after Thanos isn't a cosmic tyrant. It's a monarch of Earth, a scientist, a sorcerer, a Stark by engineering and a Doom by destiny. In Part 3, we take the final step. We connect every breadcrumb. We answer the last missing pieces. How Doom returns. How the MCU reveals Latveria. Why Strange held his finger up for Tony, not as a signal of victory, but as a funeral bell. And finally, how brother will rise against brother in a conflict that started not with Thanos, but with Howard Stark's experiment. The multiversal war isn't Kang's story. It's the Stark legacy coming home to collect what was owed. When we reach this final phase of the theory, something becomes undeniable. The story of the MCU was never just a story of heroes rising. It was the story of inheritances, of legacies passed like torches through fire, of futures being sculpted by men too afraid to face the consequences of their own brilliance. Everything comes back to 1970. Everything comes back to Howard Stark. Everything comes back to a single decision: to create children instead of raising them, to engineer destiny instead of trusting it. Tony Stark thought he spent his life fighting villains, saving worlds, and paying for his mistakes. But the truth is that he was never fighting his own mistakes. He was fighting his father's. The moment Tony sees Howard, the moment Strange sees Tony, the moment Doom feels the pull of the world he was denied, those are not coincidences. Those are the tectonic plates of destiny grinding against each other. And when tectonic plates shift, earthquakes follow. So, what happens now? We begin with the moment Tony dies. Everyone remembers the sacrifice. Everyone remembers the snap. But look more closely at Dr. Strange's face. He isn't relieved. He isn't celebrating. He looks like a man witnessing the cost of a door he knew had to be opened. A door that only opens when Stark falls. Tony's death wasn't the ending of a war. It was the beginning of a vacancy. A moment the universe has been holding open like a breath. The Stark throne was never meant to be empty. It was meant to be reclaimed. And that's where Doom enters, not as a villain stepping onto the stage, but as an heir stepping back into the room that was always his. The moment Tony falls, the balance breaks. The Stark legacy becomes unanchored. And Latveria, the nation that has waited in silence, finally has a path to rise. Now imagine how Marvel reveals this. It doesn't start with an attack. It starts with information. Classified files being unsealed. Old S.H.I.E.L.D. logs resurfacing. Someone in a current-day MCU storyline, maybe Rhodey, maybe Sam Wilson, maybe even Strange, opening a file that bears the name Project Prometheus. Inside it, a roster of engineered identities, one crossed out, one adopted, one missing. And that missing name is the catalyst. Because once the world learns that Tony Stark was not the original heir, everything shifts. The Avengers don't just lose a friend. They lose their foundation. The government doesn't just lose a defense asset. They lose the illusion that they understood who built their future. The fans always wondered how Doom would enter the MCU. He doesn't enter. He returns. A ghost given form. A mistake demanding payment. This is where the emotional gravity becomes impossible to ignore. Tony Stark became a hero because he believed he had something to prove. Doom becomes a ruler because he believes he had something taken. Tony wears armor to protect the world from himself. Doom wears armor to protect himself from the world. They are the same story, diverging at the moment of abandonment. Tony got mentorship, education, affection, even if it was imperfect. Doom got exile, modification, and a destiny he never agreed to. So, when Doom steps into the light, he does not arrive screaming for conquest. He arrives with evidence, with truth, with a declaration. I was born from the same hands that built your heroes. The difference is I remember what they did to me. And that declaration is enough to shatter the political and moral structure of the MCU. Not because it proves Doom is strong, but because it proves everyone else is wrong. Now, let's talk about Strange, because his role isn't over. Strange knew what had to happen, but knowing the outcome isn't the same as accepting the responsibility. He didn't choose Tony to die because he valued Tony less. He chose Tony because the board needed clearing before the real opponent could step forward. If Strange is the guardian of the future, Doom is the variable he couldn't eliminate. The story makes more sense when you realize Strange wasn't trying to win the Infinity War. He was trying to ensure the universe survived the coming one. And that's what redefines Endgame. The film is not a victory lap. It's a warning shot. Stark's sacrifice isn't closure. It's ignition. It lights the fuse on the next era of conflict, not cosmic but personal. The war for the multiverse might be fought in alternate timelines, but its origin lies in a hospital room in 1970, where a child was created, recorded, then erased. And now, we reach the confrontation. Not an explosion, not a battle, a meeting. Imagine a future MCU movie where Doom stands in front of whoever remains of the Avengers, Sam, Rhodey, Strange, maybe Peter Parker still trying to heal from losing his mentor, and Doom says the one sentence that changes everything. The world should have belonged to a Stark. You gave it to the wrong one. That moment becomes the emotional center of the next saga. Doom isn't stealing power. He's reclaiming purpose. The Avengers don't know whether to stop him or to understand him. Because what do you do when the villain isn't a monster, but a wound? What do you fight when the enemy is a consequence? Tony spent his life cleaning up his mistakes. They now have to clean up Howard's. The multiversal war begins not because Kang wants it. It begins because Doom demands it. Kang fractures timelines because chaos is power. Doom stabilizes timelines because control is power. Kang destroys to rule. Doom rules to rebuild. If Kang is the storm, Doom is the architect standing behind it, waiting for the world to collapse just enough for him to step over the broken ceiling and claim the throne he believes was built for him in the first place. This is why Strange's single raised finger takes on new meaning. It isn't just one outcome where they win. It's one outcome where losing Tony prevents the world from losing everything. One outcome where the future remains fragile enough for Doom to appear at the right moment. One outcome where the universe doesn't fall into the hands of the child who was erased before he ever got to exist. So, what does the MCU look like when Doom rises? Stark tech becomes contested property. Latveria becomes a superpower. Mysticism and science merge into a new form of warfare. The Avengers don't just need new armor or new weapons. They need new identities. Heroes stop being symbols and start being consequences shaped by the sins of the past. And the audience realizes something that redefines everything retroactively. Endgame was never the end. It was the introduction of a new story. The story of two brothers who never knew each other. The story of a family secret that became a global threat. The story of the child the world embraced versus the child the world erased. One became Iron Man. The other became Doom. That is why July 4th, 1970 matters. That is why Howard's words matter. That is why Strange waited. And that is why the MCU has been quiet about Latveria until the moment Tony Stark left the board. Because the universe cannot move forward until the ghost of the past comes home. And when he does, the world will learn the lesson Howard refused to accept. You can erase a name, but you cannot erase destiny. Doom isn't coming. Doom has always been here. 1970 wasn't a memory. It was a countdown. If you enjoyed this theory, if it reshaped the way you see Endgame, Tony Stark, Doctor Strange, and the future of the MCU, then make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more breakdowns exactly like this. And if you want to support the channel and help me keep creating deep dive investigations at this level, consider sending a super thanks of $20. It truly helps more than you know.